ago. Stepping stones to awareness. Right, so this is, it was just that when I started just now, this says here how the soul is placed in the body of the unborn child. But it mentions how when we die, that various people come and literally unpick us. After all this information about the entity or soul placed within the growing unborn infant, this was the first question my daughters wanted to know, and this was the answer. A great deal of the work that goes on with the living is done by men and women who work constantly and all the time to guide the living, and to see to it that after death, the other body, that's your spiritual body if you like, is taken back to the right rest plane where the particular person belongs and where the greatest number of his or her clan or family can be found. This is the best way to ensure some sort of happiness for everyone. However, apart from the actual people who work to help the living, as do we, and we also are unseen and unknown to the writer of this book, there are billions upon billions of microbes of all sorts and types, not only on one structure but on several, totally unseen not only to you but to us also. These specks of life have important work to do. They programmed will go off, seek and find and do what they must do without cessation until they begin to break down and get tired. Remember, nothing at all can last forever. Everything changes constantly. Within the human body itself are millions of these minute specks of life working to help to keep the human body alive, and also in the bodies of animals. Once anybody dies, wherever it might be, and if it is not detected by fond relatives and friends, the body itself releases microbes quite automatically. This is all part of the death process, and these will find their way to a sort of central control system which works for the every living planet. This sets up an automated plan for the bringing of the living to their proper resting place. Very often loved ones, long since dead and known to the dying, are sent to help to make the end of their lives easier and less painful and lonely. In birth, it acts in much the same way. Once an ovary has successfully mated with a male sperm, the female body emits millions of these unseen microbes, which find their way unaided to the right part of the control system. These microbes are different, as are skin cells and scraps of bone tissue for each individual person. The whole way in which the womb works, inducing life, fits into the complex network which creates life for each planet. These microbes are emitted constantly until the right moment for the fusion of the soul or entity has come. Meantime, other microbes programmed in the vast computer work to find the right soul for each birth. Once this is done, the special microbes will carry this tiny speck, which is in all of us, without a body, back to the forming embryo in the new host mother. The extraordinary way that the soul then begins to work on the living flesh for both structures is not really fully understood, but work it does to restore the unborn person to life in a body as nearly right for the inner entity as can be achieved with the material available. Only humanity on the living planet can produce and create new life, new bodies, and we hope in the future with new knowledge the living will give greater thought to the sorts of children they will bring into the world. An intelligent look at an ant colony, a beehive, and many other forms of life similar will help to show the reader that nature reproduces itself over and over again. Even the human body itself is programmed and full of microbes which must work constantly, each to his special task to keep the body functioning from the brain, which is the powerhouse of the body. Humanity itself is programmed to a lesser or greater extent, and everyone has his or her place in the scheme of things. Only a very few are ever intelligent enough to run large organizations, to govern, of whatever race they may be. We hope to show in these dictations from the other side, for that is what they are, how the scheme of things is meant to work, but sadly rarely does. So, from the point of view of the soul, once it's placed into the little embryo, the little embryo has to be a fully formed body. So it will be perfect, except perhaps for its nails. but minute. I think it's about, I can't remember how big it is. It's probably about 3 inches long at 12 weeks. I may be wrong there. And that's when the entity goes in. We call it the quickening. So the entity is sort of guided into the tiny body. It can fail, in which case the little body is aborted. But it is then this little entity which forms the body. And in fact, in very basic creatures, you can see this working. They have managed to photograph, they can photograph the aura of human beings. And they have managed to show, say, something very basic, like, you know, a salamander, which is a very basic creature. And you can see, over the fertilized embryo, you can see the adult entity actually growing the body. So that must be exactly the same as us. And apparently you can see the, I've never actually seen it, but I have noticed sometimes that a woman's eyes are much more bright, that in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy, you're supposed to be able to see the shen, or the spirit of the other person. I've not actually seen it, but anyway. And the other thing I wanted to mention, that in the same way, when the body breaks down, there has been, you know, when we die, and, you know, the digestive tract starts to digest us, and we are full of these little friendly microbes within us. And there has been, at different times, people have talked about the, thankfully, very rare thing of spontaneous combustion. And this is when, for some reason or other, something has gone wrong. And all these little entities have not been collected up properly by the people who are sent to do it. And so these little entities, to survive, you could almost liken them to a swarm of bees, have to find another body straight away. And there have been various stories of people who have been found, and there's been nothing left of the human body, just a sort of smear of grease and their clothes. But there was a priest in the late 1800s, I think, and it was in one of Dennis Wheatley's books, which my mother had at one time, where it described this priest who was praying in the sacristy, and maybe he'd had a funeral, or there was a body waiting for a funeral or something, I don't know. However, he was praying in the sacristy, and he looked down and he could see these flames coming out of over his leg. So he beat at it and it went out, and then it came again, and he beat at it and it came again. He ran from the church, terrified. He got into his house and the whole thing stopped, and he was in the most awful state. But I think he had some kind of a burn on his leg ever afterwards, but his cassock was completely unburned. So obviously the entities, or the microbes from the dead body nearby, or one he'd buried or something, had escaped, and they were trying to get into his body, but his microbes were fighting them off. So these microbes are very important. So that was that bit.
How do you fight them off?
Well, you can't. If physically you can't do anything about it, but it's automatic. It's the entities that live within you. I mean, even if you cut yourself with a knife by accident, the entity, there has to be a certain entities and microbes, and also the thrombin and all the things that come to actually, heal your scar. So there's a mass of things within you. When we have a virus, we know that antibiotics don't work on a virus, because the virus is your body, is your entities, your these little microbes that live within you, plus your white blood cells and all the other things. That is their reaction to try and heal the human body from filth that you've eaten or drunk or breathed in, or it's unhealthiness, basically. And funnily enough, after you've had a cold virus, even though it's pretty miserable at the time, you often feel a lot better afterwards, once you're through it. So that's the whole thing. Human body is a very amazing thing. So we've got here reincarnation as it applies to all living things. There are very few religions that speak a great deal about reincarnation, because it would seem that humanity likes to believe in a sort of paradise. I'm hoping I'm not doing this all over again. Likes to believe in a sort of paradise, or a rising up according to goodness of worth, to a sort of nirvana, far from above ordinary humanity. Discard your life, it says in the Christian Bible. Build not up for yourself these things that will rot, only these things that will carry with you into a sort of afterlife, those things that cannot decay. It is extraordinary that although these views are even the secret beliefs of many who do not subscribe to any particular religion whatsoever, there is no known evidence that anyone has ever come back from the dead and spoken clearly to the living and described life after death, death itself, or confirmed that indeed people can expect to come to some sort of paradise. It is simply assumed that these facts are the case. In these dictations, which we have chosen to give the writer, we, who are in fact dead and have access to tremendous knowledge from a completely different viewpoint to those who are among the living, intend that this situation be rectified without delay. No one has ever come back and told the living anything whatsoever that is important. Indeed, there are many thousands of mediums, and what knowledge have any of them ever given to the living? None. All they do is convince people that some beloved relative who has passed over and wishes still to speak with them. There can be no real proof that they really are talking to their loved ones, excepting in the extraordinary knowledge that is passed on by the medium, who is usually a stranger to the sorrowing relative. There is no proof of reincarnation, because indeed, how can there be? What can be done to tell people that Great Uncle Jack, who looks exactly like his great nephew, is indeed only Great Uncle Jack, returned within his own family, which is just what is meant to happen? No one is born anything but naked, helpless, and utterly dependent upon their relatives, which in the long run, as those who read this book will discover, is the case from the beginning to the end. In the beginning there was a plan set down by those whose task it was to try and run this planet and to bring order out of chaos. Nothing that they tried to bring about was ever done, and you have today a complete travesty after 2 disastrous wars of what ought to have been. Life is precious, much, much more precious than anyone who enjoys it can ever realize, until their bodies have died and they are faced with an interminable life here. Until they can be reborn sometime, this proves impossible. As has already been dictated to the writer, some return, some never. Let us proceed to explain how reincarnation works and the original plan for this world's humanity. Made some 500 years ago, when most countries had some sort of royal family and life was medieval and simple and travel extremely difficult. Ordinary people live, very often over and over again, but not always looking exactly the same. Sometimes they may be a little taller or have long features or even different colouring. Everything depends upon the marriage that has taken place, descending from their own children, possibly several hundreds of years. All reincarnation must take place through the loins of each person. In other words, unless you have planted your seed during a physical lifetime, there is no way that you can return to the living from that particular life. And unless, therefore, you have another branch of your own family from a previous lifetime, which can be traced down to a suitable time and set of parents, you are doomed to remain on the rest planes, as they are called, until your fate is decided. Many questions will of course be asked. How are you born in the first place? If you have never lived before in this particular planet, this vexing question we shall answer as clearly as possible. Life, birth and death are all such complicated issues that we can give to ordinary people who are not advanced scientists only basic information. Ordinary people have all lived before somewhere, and often they come from another planet. Once a planet has failed, then that planet's humanity can only hope to set off on a very long, long journey, which may take up to several thousand years until another suitable living planet is found for them to live on. Only the most worthwhile and intelligent people are chosen, in exactly the same way as with lower animals. Let living humanity remember that it is worth striving. If they wish to remain among the living and to live honourable and godly lives, all of this we hope to explain as simply as possible for all to understand. As we have said already, the entity or soul of any living creature can be reduced in size, where it has no body whatsoever, to an infinitesimal speck of life, something like a minute computer, when in this state. It must be stored away, and most often where the required person is extremely intelligent and needed somewhere in the universe, the means for his or her rebirth are stored away altogether. It may be shocking to the living, but male sperm and female ovaries, even in the early state of fertilization, can be collected by people who work on our structure and stored away in an extremely specialized way and kept indefinitely until required. Once a suitable host mother is found, that highly intelligent person may be forced to live in a primitive planet where he or she has never lived before, to bring specialist knowledge and experiments to help to develop that planet. He or she may live there for several lifetimes before returning to their original home and continuing in the sort of developed environment they were once used to. Anyone who looks at the past history of this planet can see all sorts of scientists, engineers, who realize within themselves that there ought to be all sorts of wonderful inventions they enjoyed in some other lifetime elsewhere, and set about trying to invent. Norman Whittle was one, but he, as we shall explain in another dictation, got his calculations just slightly wrong. Louis Pasteur, the French scientist, Michael Faraday, who did early work on the separation of water, and hosts of others. Skilled fiction and other writers whose writings only stem from some long-dead memory. All these sorts of people have helped to create your planet as the thoroughly modern planet it now is. As we have dictated already, it takes millions of years to create the lowliest of humanity, and more than this, in many more lifetimes, to create the most intelligent and gifted of people, with whom no planet would ever be more than the most dreary and monotonous place for people to live in, from the richest to the poorest and from the highest to the lowest. Work, in fact, must go on without cessation throughout the universe to find new planets to help to colonize them, and to see that the right people are recreated wherever they are needed. All of humanity must be watched, recorded, guarded over, to try to create a life of a desirable kind for everybody. Unfortunately, things do not always go right. People in power sometimes seize it for their own benefit, as they imagine, grow weary and discontented, envy the living, and feel themselves to be stuck in hopeless situations working for others, when they have no hope for future lifetime themselves. Everyone, in fact, must have something to look forward to, no matter where he or she lives and works, and some sort of happiness, or they cease to care and give up, and everyone who depends on them suffers. This is something else we shall speak about in the book. 500 years ago, the then Council for the Government, headed by your saviour for this planet, met and came to total disagreement. The only way to bring peace, to treat from country to country and prove reincarnation, is by those persons set in positions of wealth and power, about whom much is written, and expensive portraits are painted. Portraits which pass down within royal families and are displayed for all to see on the walls of large royal establishments, where many people must be entertained constantly, not only in this century, but in all of those centuries that have gone before. How many ordinary families really have very much of a family history that can be traced? How many have anything but a few faded photographs, and before photography, absolutely nothing? Ordinary people are indeed reincarnated all the time, but there is no way that they can ever know who they were before, as all memories die on rebirth. There are people still living on the rest plains who remember, as if it were yesterday, their last lifetime in the time of Queen Elizabeth I. But if they were to live once more now in this century, all those memories would be lost to them. All that people are left with are vague dislikes and the certainty that they have lived before, and even recognise certain towns and places where perhaps they have been before, but never anything very definite. Déjà vus are often past memories flooding back, but disconnected with anything that would prove anything. This is in the long run, is the best way, for who could manage to live with crowds of memories of endless lifetimes, many of them pointless in the modern day and age. All too often, memories of past lives would bring deepest sorrow for the greatest unhappiness of all, the loss of someone deeply loved and never really found again. This too happens all too frequently as a young person searches hopelessly for a mate, knowing somehow that the right person just never comes along. All too often they have been left behind on the rest plains and simply cannot come along. This is something else we hope to speak of in another chapter. Not only, of course, do human beings live not once but endlessly over and over again, but if they are fortunate, but it must be understood, but progression as a human being can only take place in the physical life. Creation can only take place in physical life, and both the physical and non-physical bodies can only be created in the physical parts of this universe. This applies to all creatures, whether they be fish, birds, animals, and even plants. Whereas, however, there are rest planes for human beings, there are none for animals or birds, insects or fish, or in fact for lower animals. Sometimes for comfort, a very much loved animal or pet is allowed to be kept by someone who must remain on the rest planes, and they are allowed to have a dog or a bird. But mainly these things are left behind. Some horses are used for decorative purposes and for pleasure on the rest planes, which, let us tell the living, are extremely beautiful. It is only man in his folly that turns beautiful nature into something hideous and ugly. Birds, which are often very beautiful, are often seen in the lovely gardens to be found here, singing their sweet songs, and this adds joy to these imprisoned here for too long. Mostly birds are reincarnated over and over again. The entity of a dead bird will almost immediately be placed in the forming egg of a new body. There is also the very strange fact that many people will find perhaps unpalatable to believe, that is, that many lowly animals, insects, and indeed birds are used as messengers, not only in the universe itself, that is to say within the living planet, but within a host body. All bodies are hosts for billions of minute specks of life that work within them, and without these microbes, as we have already said, no living body, be it animal or human, could function. This fact has something to do with the poltergeist disturbance that sometimes happens and are inexplicable. I've got a dictation about that, which I will read another time. As we've said already, all of nature is similar, and a complete human body is so very similar to the complete planet, running from the central core of fire within the brain, which is the powerhouse, and from which are the instructions come. Lowly creatures are in use constantly whilst not living as some sort of insect. They too progress from lifetime to lifetime, as do human beings, and move slowly towards humanity itself. In another chapter we shall describe how planets are colonized and slow, laborious work that must go on constantly to create a new living planet. What happens in the end to humanity one can only guess. This universe is vast and enormous, and it's believed and even known that elsewhere, where there are larger planets of greater complexity than even these small ones here, there must be even larger ones where possibly a humanity of far greater intelligence exists, always searching for new people. The best in science, art, and all other types of skills are doubtless eventually creamed off, and found to be creamed off, given larger bodies, and set to live in these very much larger, more complex types of planets. Beyond this vast universe, perhaps there are more, even more enormous and amazing than this one. We who dictate this may only speculate and wonder as life goes endlessly on and people are reborn not once but over and over again. Only in complete knowledge can modern human people who have access to horrific weapons come to Only in complete knowledge can modern people who have access to horrific weapons come to true happiness and in the end save themselves from being denied the privilege of rebirth in their own planet. Indeed, there are billions of planets crying out for more and more people, but no one knows what state of civilization they are in and what sort of life they can offer. Let us hope that this planet can be advanced as it must be and improved within the next few hundred years, when it could become a simply marvellous place to live, not once but over and over again. Right, there we go. That's it, I think. This is another bit. This is the thing about the Russians. So, there we are. Let's finish that.